This is the Soulfilled Sisterhood podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Burgess, a licensed marriage and family therapist and a soul-led leadership coach to women in midlife who are wanting more meaning in the second half. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute, nor is it to convey professional, psychological, financial, or medical advice. If you could use such services, please seek them out from someone you trust. Episode 136. If you are liking what you're hearing on the Soulfilled Sisterhood podcast, I encourage you to go out to iTunes and leave me either a star rating and/or go in there and put in an actual review itself. It helps with the algorithms, which then helps promote the podcast for other women to find it when they're searching in iTunes. Thank you again for your support. Now, here is today's episode. Well, welcome, sisters. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for our guest today. I have Dr. Dawson Church on, and I know while he is the first guy I have had on my podcast, I couldn't resist asking if he would be on. He already has this infectious laugh, so I think this is how the podcast is going to go. But Dawson Church is a PhD.
Yeah, Nicole, people won't take us seriously.
Well, don't worry, we'll get serious in a second. But for now,
well, we have as much fun on the air as we already had off the air. It'll be great.
Exactly. Well, Dawson Church is a PhD. He's a health writer and researcher who has edited or authored a number of books in the field of health, psychology, and spirituality. He is an award-winning science writer for 3 best-selling books to his credit. The first one is The Genie in Your Genes, and that was the first book written that demonstrated that emotions drive gene expression. His second book is Mind to Matter, which showed the brain creates much of what we think as an objective reality. And the book we're going to talk about today is called Bliss Brain, which demonstrates the peak mental states rapidly remodel the brain for happiness. Dawson has conducted dozens of clinical trials and founded the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare to promote groundbreaking new treatments. Its largest program, the Veteran Stress Project, has offered free treatment to over 20,000 veterans with PTSD over the past decade. Dawson shares how to apply these health and performance breakthroughs through EFT Universe, one of the largest alternative medicine sites on the web. And if you don't know what EFT stands for, it's the Emotional Freedom Techniques. So Dawson, again, I just want to say thank you so much for being on today. And yeah, being here so we can share more of your book for my listeners. Thank you.
Oh, it's an absolute joy. Thanks for having me, Nicole.
I wanted to first say that, reading your book, Bliss Brain, I just love how you acknowledge when science and mysticism come together, they form such a potent transformational combination. And I know you said that in the book. And I believe that our spirituality has informed so much of science. And with science, we can now see how spirituality also changes our brain, immune systems, and heal more and everything. So can you share, what made you want to write this book? I also know you have another book coming out, which just blows me away. But why did you want to write this book?
I wanted to write this book because I wanted to share with other people just how happy they can get. And I know this sounds a little odd, but it's actually quite hard to convey to people how happy you can get. And I'll give you one example of the gap between average experience and possible experience. Mm-hmm. And in Bliss Brain, I talk a lot about the studies of adepts, spiritual adepts, people like Franciscan nuns who spent 20 or 30 years in contemplative prayer, or Tibetan monks who've spent more than 25,000 hours in meditation. And so these are people who have developed their spirituality to an extraordinary degree. They've often gone into a spiritual profession, like being a full-time renunciate, and really focusing on that part of their lives. And here's the challenge that as a science writer I have. Nicole, when researchers hook these people up to MRIs, and they enter those elevated states, we read a whole series of brain waves to see what's going on in terms of how much they're thinking. Like when you do different styles of meditation, different brain waves become active. If you're doing a really, an act of compassion meditation, you'll have a lot of beta waves. If you're doing watching thoughts, you'll have fewer beta waves, more alpha. But the one wave we look for is gamma. And gamma is the wave of integration. It's the wave of creativity, of insight. When people have just brilliant ideas, they have lots of gamma. At our moments of peak insight, we have lots of gamma, and gamma organizes all the different parts of the brain to work together to solve a problem and to pull in their disparate pieces of information into a holistic idea. And so gamma is this wave of integration, but it's also the wave of happiness. When you're happy, you have more gamma, you have lots of gamma, as well as being more inspired, more creative, and all those other positive emotions. So when we hook these adepts up to MRIs and have them enter those states, this happiness wave, this happiness marker goes up 25-fold.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, if I told you that you could be 25% more happy, you'd probably say, wow, it sounds cool. How do I do that? Or even 50% more. I mean, imagine being 50% happier than you are today, or even twice as happy. And that's like a credible number. But this is like, if I told you, like I've studied athletes, for example, if I told you that this amazing basketball player has a vertical jump height, can jump 1 foot off the ground from a standing start. This amazing athlete can jump 1 foot off the ground. You'd be impressed. But if I told you that this athlete could jump 25 feet off the ground, you think I was nuts. And that's the problem we face in this work. It's actually impossible for the average person to comprehend just how happy these adepts are. So in Bliss Brain, I wanted to make that point and also chart a path that now that we have the MRI research, we can help you get there too. And in the newest studies, it's not taking 10,000 hours. It's not taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. It's not doing a lifetime in a monastery. It's not shutting yourself off from social contact, except for other monks and nuns. It's being in an office. It's being a mother. It's being a father. It's being an athlete. It's being a regular person. And we're now finding with these advanced techniques, we can get people there in a few weeks. So we can be immensely, I mean, unbelievably more happy than we are. And it with modern neuroscience-based tools, it doesn't take 10,000 hours. That's the real thrust of Bliss Brain.
And I love, because again, if anyone listening to this, you love to geek out on brain science stuff like I do, I'm like, oh my gosh, look, it's details about how this changes this part of the brain and it can do this and this. It's like we know meditation can do a lot of these things, but this technique that you have developed or how you've incorporated multiple things into one thing, it's really amazing how you have given so many different research, data points to really build upon all of this. And it is fascinating how we don't have to, like you say, go away somewhere to achieve this. We can do it in our everyday lives every single day to get to this rebuilding, to get to this resilience, all of this. So before I go a little further on that, share just a little bit. Again, I read your sequence of what it is you've come up with and I laughed at myself. I'm like, so simple. Yet I had literally been like, I don't have time to do X and then Y, then this, then that. I was creating all these separate like little practices. And you created something called eco meditation. Share a little bit more, like how on earth did you come up with this sequence and develop this method basically?
It was kind of whimsical. If you can imagine the little boy in the ice cream store and he is looking at the 35 flavors there, and there's praline pecan, and there's rocky road, and there's Neapolitan, and there are so these yummy flavors. And I was the little boy who'd look at them and say, I want them all.
Can I get that? And you're like, little that.
Yeah, as the old joke is about what the what the Buddhist monk asked the hot dog vendor, make me one with everything. So I look at all these different techniques, and I remember at a conference with Roland McCready from HeartMath and Joe Dispenza and Bruce Lipton and all these people in 2007, and
Mhm.
I thought it was talking about how great HeartMath is and how effective it is at inducing heart coherence, and then
Mhm.
hypnosis, and then mindfulness we know is effective, and we know EFT tapping is great. And so I thought, well, what if I just get one of everything and stack them on top of each other like a giant ice cream cone, and we just eat our through all way through all the best meditation techniques in about 5 minutes. And that's what
Mhm.
it takes. It takes about 5 minutes to induce this state. And it turns out if you just do these things mechanically, first of all, they're all physiological practices. Some of them require a little bit of visualization, not hard visualization, easy visualization that people are able to do, but they're just simple things. Relax your tongue, breathe 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out, relax this muscle, and so they're all physiologically based.
Mhm.
And what you get to is a state that is actually at more advanced than most meditation masters ever get to by the measure of heart coherence. Because Roland McCready said to me at that conference, he said, Dawson, we have hooked up lots of meditators to our heart coherence machines, and when they meditate, they drop out of coherence. Now, when Roland told me that, I was like, no way. Surely
Wow.
meditators are in coherence.
Mhm.
So I tunneled back home to Santa Rosa, California, where I lived, and I happened to have a meditator as a housemate, a wonderful minister, Unity minister, been minister for many, many years, meditated every day. And I said, Jeff, yeah, I'm going to put these electrodes on your head. Do you mind? And I hooked him up, and he's just such a beautiful man. He's just an amazing being, and he was just in perfect coherence. And I
Uh-huh.
said, now, Jeff, meditate. And boom, he fell out. I was really puzzled. I said, well,
Wow.
Jeff, stop meditating. They went back into heart coherence. And sure enough, Roland was right that when people meditate, they actually drop out of heart coherence. So I said, okay, we want to be not just in the state of a meditation master and having all the physiological activities going on that meditation master has. We want to, in addition to that, we want the cherry on top of you being in, first of all, coherence, and
Mhm.
then deep coherence. And so I just designed a series of simple steps, 7 steps, and it puts you there. And wow, people, like I just talked to somebody, I have a whole big group in France that I talk to every month. They said, several of them said on the call, we heard about you, we began doing the meditation in December, and here it is, we're just months later, we're still doing the meditation. So the this meditation, it's so easy, but
Mhm.
also it's addictive. You just
It,
feel so good, so quick.
yeah.
And very occasionally, Nicole, I hear somebody say, I tried it, it didn't work for me. But like one person in 1,000, it's really hard not to get into a deep state with eco meditation. So it's powerful to use this technique, and you don't have to still your mind. That's the other thing. I've never been able to still my own personal mind, and so you don't have to have a quiet mind, which I am
Yeah.
incapable of accomplishing myself. So.
Well, and I'm laughing only because I know you talk some about that in the book too, about our monkey brain, but also just
Yeah.
our own little like, kind of demon mind that likes to talk so much. And it's true. That's what I loved about your technique. It's bringing all these beautiful methods together. And it is, you can go deeper so much quicker. And I'm like, dang, it's so simple. And it's like, there's no reason not to do it. And like you said, you really do emphasize even in the book, it's like instead of, for the addicts who, were turning to alcohol, drugs, different things, it's like, let's get addicted to how you feel good already and you don't have any negative side effects. And here's some examples of all the different, things that are released when you're doing this technique. And it's like, yeah, I want more of that. I'll keep taking that. Thank you very much. And yeah, you don't have to do it for hours and hours and hours.
Let me just read you a quote that a woman sent me very soon after I put eco meditation on the web.
Mm-hmm.
And I put eco meditation up on the web for free. And I left it there for many, many years. And eventually, like after 4 or 5 years, the webmaster said to me, Dawson, do you realize we're getting 20,000 people visiting that crummy web page every single month?
Wow.
why don't you actually do something with eco meditation? So we prettied up the web page and put up many more resources there.
Hmm.
But that's what happened is we found people becoming addicted to eco meditation, and that was a really interesting thing. Is that why were people trying it once or trying it twice, and suddenly they were just like all over it, doing it over and over and over again.
Hmm.
So this woman called Tony Tomlinson. And here's what Tony wrote to us. We've just got hundreds of people sending us messages like this now because she's a really classic person who tried it once and then got addicted and it didn't take long. So she says, when I first sat down to do the 7 steps of eco meditation, I was totally burned out on life and parenting, and I was in high stress, high cortisol about 99% of the time. When I sat down, my self-talk was, Tony, this is never going to work for you. Nothing else has worked for you. You're wasting your time with this as well. And then when I hit step 3, tears of ecstasy began to roll down my cheeks, and I found myself in the bliss I'd always wanted. And then she ends up by saying, Dawson, I'm going to do eco meditation every single day. And that's what happens. People get addicted because these neurochemicals, they're highly addictive.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is THC. It's the same chemical that is found in marijuana. Mm-hmm. THC is what docks with receptor sites in what's called your endocannabinoid system in your body. And these are endogenous cannabinoids. These are cannabis-like molecules in your body. So if you smoke weed, you get THC docking with these things, making you high. But if you do eco meditation, you get anandamide, an endogenous molecule your brain produces all by itself, and you get that flooding your brain and you feel high. So Tony is feeling this rush of this THC-like chemical in her brain. Mm-hmm. Somebody else this last week said to me, Dawson, I'm having all these hallucinations when I do eco meditation. I'm like, that's great because that means you're getting floods of serotonin. Mm-hmm. And serotonin, your feel-good hormone, feel-good neurotransmitter, has the same chemical structure as psilocybin, magic mushrooms. And psilocybin only works because it docks with serotonin receptors in your brain. So dopamine, you're getting this dose of like this cocaine-like substance in the base of your brain. So you're getting dopamine on top of the THC, on top of the serotonin and anandamide, and all these really powerful, pleasurable neurochemicals sloshing around in your brain at the same time. And at that point, you can't stop people from doing eco meditation.
No, it's kind of like, ooh, give me more, give me more.
So I have the pleasure to announce, Nicole, that I'm churning out tens of thousands of hopeless addicts every month.
Oh, so beautiful. These are good addicts in the sense that there's good no addicts. Negative side effects. Oh, I love it. I want to shift gears just a touch because after like people are doing this, I really want to dive into, because I know I've talked a little bit about trauma on my podcast, even though it's not exclusively about trauma. And you have a chapter that is called The Resilient Brain. And you say trauma is everywhere, which I agree with. And on page 250, I'm just going to read a small little paragraph that I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so true. You said childhood trauma also inhibits brain formation. Adults who, as children, were deprived of nurturing have brains that are 8.6% smaller. The more severe the deprivation, the smaller the brain size. Epigenetically and neurologically, trauma shapes the matter of which our cells are constructed. And I remember when I just got done with grad school, I was working at a place doing my internship as a marriage family therapist. And I worked a lot with domestic violence, people that had experienced that and little kids with that. And I remember learning that from one of the organizations, they said, yeah, the baby's brain is actually going to be smaller because they're consistently, repeatedly, in being impacted by trauma. And even this just, deprived of nurturing have a smaller brain. But the beautiful thing about the work you're doing, it's also instilling hope that we can truly change this, because now as adults, you talk about, we have a choice, and how doing this meditation, how really working on this will help people reach more of their full potential and not stay stuck in the past.
Yep.
I just,
Yeah, and you need to do both. And so for the 10 years before I began researching elevated states, I was researching trauma.
mm-hmm.
And I was doing my earliest pilot studies around 2004. And then I went on to doing full-scale randomized controlled trials. I had a meta-analysis of several different studies. And so I've been heavily involved in trauma. I also founded the Veteran Stress Project in 2007, and we've treated tens of thousands of veterans with PTSD free of charge. Mm-hmm. So I have this big, long career in trauma. And when, you mentioned there's a lot of trauma out there, one girl in 3 is molested. Mm-hmm. One boy in 5 is molested. Mm-hmm. Those are the numbers from the Department of Health and Human Services. So what half of all teenagers witness or are the victims of physical violence, mm-hmm. Community violence every year. So, I mean, trauma and abuse is just a huge problem. Right. And so I have this whole phase of my research career studying trauma, and it showed not only that there's a lot of trauma out there, but it showed that people can heal again really, really quickly. And that's why I teach EFT tapping, because EFT acupressure tapping is super quick. Mm-hmm. And we take those veterans through 6 one-hour EFT sessions. And after that, their flashbacks, their nightmares, their hypervigilance, all of those symptoms of PTSD just go away. And when I first heard therapists telling me this, they were treating veterans coming back from Afghanistan in 2004. Mm-hmm. And therapists were telling me, I worked with this guy and he had all these symptoms and they just went away. Then others told me, I worked with a Korean War veteran, a Vietnam War veteran, and Iraq War, Gulf War I veteran, and they're fine now. And they had 5 sessions. I'm thinking, no way, because the best evidence back then was that, in the words of the American Psychiatric Association, which commissioned a comprehensive review of all the PTSD research in 2005, it said PTSD is a treatment-resistant condition that can at best be managed with drugs. That there was no even glimmer of hope of recovery. And now we're seeing people recover in just a few sessions. So now I don't know how many EFT studies there are, but they're between EFT and EMDR, mm-hmm. because they both pretty much do the same thing. Mm-hmm. There are probably 50 studies of PTSD. Rwandan orphans whose parents were hacked to death before their eyes mm-hmm. in the 1994 genocide there. Many of them recover using these techniques. Veterans of the Iran-Iraq War, Vietnam veterans in the U.S., domestic violence survivors, women who survived sexual violence during the Congolese Civil War, mm-hmm. All of these groups, and they recover from PTSD. So you have to do the trauma piece first, and the research shows that if you try and hit the elevated states that Tony Tomlinson is talking about, and you don't also deal with your own trauma, that you are at much greater risk of things like the dark night of the soul type mm-hmm. experience. You can actually reactivate old wounds by hitting these elevated states, because they're so divorced from those terrified versions of you crouching in the subconscious in terror, those frozen children in your psyche. Mm-hmm. And so you have to go and love them and integrate them, as well as the elevated states. If you go straight to the elevated states, then you find things like the dark side. You find, and I don't want to mention names, but there's been a giant scandal in Buddhism with financial and sexual abuse in the last 3 years. Giant scandal in Christianity at Liberty University mm-hmm. with sexual and financial abuse. In Hinduism, in Judaism, every single religion has these elevated masters, and they look so good on paper, and they have thousands of followers, and then you discover that they're abusing people. Mm-hmm. John of God, I mean, another one I will name names. 700 women have now come forward and said they were abused by him. Wow. So that's what happens when you aim for the mountaintop, go for the elevated state, go for enlightenment, and you don't also heal trauma. Yeah. So it's a both and approach.
And I appreciate you really making that distinction too, because it's like otherwise it's like the whole bypassing. It's like, nope, we've got to do this
Yep.
work first before we can get there. And I also love you really brought this term that I hadn't, I mean, again, I've worked in trauma for years, but I really hadn't heard it this way. You talked about, okay, yeah, there's a lot of information on post-traumatic stress disorder, but not a lot about post-traumatic growth. Meaning, again, there's that hope that we can really move through this and recover from it, like you were saying, versus being stuck in it forever and a day. It's like, well, yeah, you don't give anybody hope if there's like, sorry, you can't get through that. That's all you're going to have the rest of your life.
Yeah, we all know about the brain's negativity bias, that the brain prioritizes negative incoming information, and it does that for the very sound evolutionary reason that that's what kept our ancestors safe. They needed to notice the snake in the grass and avoid it, and it was far more important than noticing how good the roses smelled. So there was an evolutionary premium for noticing the bad stuff, and there was absolutely no evolutionary benefit in noticing the beautiful colors of the sunset 100,000 years ago, when our basic mammalian and primate structure was being formed. So we're heavily biased to negativity in terms of brain structure and function, and then we're that way socially as well. So when you look at the news, there's such a focus on what's going wrong.
Yes.
And there's just story after story after story about the bad stuff. And there's so little focus on what's going right. And so that is our brain's negativity bias writ large societally. And so here in our society, we've got all this bad stuff that we this keeps being served to us by the media. And it's easy to think that that's reality. And so for the last chapter of Bliss Brain, I'm giving people a big wake-up call. I'm saying, hey, folks, that's not reality. Let's go look at the actual data of how we're doing as human beings in terms of decency and life expectancy and health and female literacy, female education. Things like female literacy have exploded over the last 30 years. Maternal life expectancy, the chances of dying in childbirth are far, far less than they were just a few decades ago. All these measures like wealth. The average global citizen today is 3 times as wealthy as he or she was in 1980. Carbon emissions, we are emitting per capita about half the carbon we were in 1990. We're sequestering carbon. We have giant plants now that are actually sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. We have the Trillion Tree Project, which is aiming to plant 1 trillion trees, which, if successful, would take us back to the carbon levels before the Industrial Revolution. I mean, there are just so many thousands of metrics that show that we're doing well as a planet. And yet, because of a negativity bias, we keep on focusing on the bad stuff. So it really takes a lot of consciousness to say, I'm just not going to pay undue weight to that. Pay due weight to that. By all means, don't walk across the road when there are cars coming. You don't need, but just pay attention to the bad stuff that's a real threat. Don't pay attention to the endless drone of negative news out there, because when you start to look at all the positive stuff going on, it far outweighs the negative.
And it is fascinating. And I love how you do point that out in the book, because it's just like, we don't hear that doesn't get reverberated over and over and over and over and over every day. It is only like the fear stuff and the negative stuff. And it's like, oh my gosh, everything's coming to an end. It's like, no, it's not. It's like, it really is being more selective. And again, that's also part of what you talk about in the book, really, for us saying we do have a choice in where we put our attention. And that is the training of this. That is growing more into being emotionally neutral versus reactive, because more often than not, we are very reactive when we're in that fear state or survival state. And it's like, if you're really not being truly threatened, like there really is no saber-tooth tiger coming at you.
Right.
It's like, there is a different way of being and a different level of consciousness. So really appreciate you pointing that out and driving that home. Truly, just like, let's do a fact check on this. So amazing. Well, I'm curious, Dawson. I mean, there's so much I had so many different questions. You already talked about some of the things. I'm like, oh, there's just so much good stuff. Is there anything that I missed in asking you that you also, and we'll talk about your website in just a second where people can get the book and more about you, but is there anything else you wanted to highlight from all this research that you've done and from the feedback you're getting from people who are using this technique that you wanted to share that maybe I've missed?
So the 25 times happier one is really worth being aware of, that we can all become way happier than we are today. And that's just science. It's just facts. It's just empirical. And that's all there in Bliss Brain. So I show you that. I also talk about those neurochemicals, how you generate those in your brain, how you addict yourself to good feeling rather than addicting yourself to cortisol and other stress neurochemicals that will make you feel bad. The other startling, remarkable thing that I want people to walk away from Bliss Brain with is that you can do this really fast. And the example I use is the case history I have in the book is of a TV reporter called Graham Phillips. And he's an Australian reporter. He has a show called Catalyst, and he'd heard about mindfulness meditation and decided to take a class in it that was going to be 8 weeks long. But before that, being a TV guy, he took his whole crew into an advanced neuroimaging lab and had a whole series of tests done on his biology and his brain. And with high-resolution MRI scanners, the researchers measured every single neuron in his brain and how big the size of each brain region was, how big it was, what was the volume of his hippocampus and his thalamus and his hypothalamus and his parietal lobe and his occipital lobe. And then every single part of his brain was mapped down to the level of a cell. And so he then, after this brain mapping, went on this journey of learning mindfulness, learning meditation. And within 2 weeks, he felt better. He had less road rage. He was less reactive to people. He was becoming a nicer person. After 8 weeks, he went back into the lab and they parked him in the MRI again, took another set of high resolution images of his brain. Now, bear in mind, this is only 2 months apart, these brain maps. And they're high resolution. They're measuring the volume of tissue in each part of his brain. And some parts of his brain in only 2 months grew by 2 or 3 or 4% in only 2 months. But one part of his brain, tiny little sliver of tissue, it's about the size of my fingernail, little bit of tissue called the dentate gyrus. And the job of this little structure in the center of our brains is to regulate our emotions brain-wide. So it has tentacles going all over the place, and it means that if you have a well-developed dentate gyrus, you have good emotional regulation, you don't blow up at people, you don't have a lot of free-floating anger or anxiety, you can regulate your emotions. And so in 8 weeks, the volume of tissue in Graham Phillips's dentate gyrus grew by 22.8%.
Wow.
In just 2 months. That's how quickly the hardware of our brains is being remodeled by the software of our consciousness. And people have no idea. I mean, neuroscientists don't realize this. Doctors have no idea. Medical professionals don't realize this. We are literally restructuring our brains. I mean, imagine if you could start working out in a gym and make a muscle 22.8% bigger in 2 months. It doesn't happen. But that's what we can do in our brains. And it's not just any old piece of tissue. I mean, this is what regulates your emotions. It means you don't blow up at your 8-year-old when she spills her cereal on the floor. You don't get all mad at your husband when he interrupts you. You don't feel resentful toward your colleague when she gets a promotion. So all of these changes happen, and we have good emotional regulation. And if we have good emotional, if we can regulate all of those emotions of annoyance, of criticism, of resentment, anger, guilt, shame, blame, if we can regulate our emotions, we have an infinitely better life. So that's the cornerstone. And then you go and build parts of the brain like the hippocampus, memory and learning, that starts to grow. You shrink parts of the brain like these advanced meditators, their amygdala, their fire alarm of the brain literally atrophies from disuse. So you are literally changing the hardware of your brain, the software of your mind. And that's the other big thing. We can do it, and we can do it quickly, and our lives can be a lot better, and we get 25 times as happy. We get addicted to feeling that happy. And then so we go around and start writing books about it called Bliss Brain, because we just want to share it with everybody in the whole wide world.
Well, and what a concept too, to think like if the whole world did this and the planet became 25 times happier, holy cow, that's just huge. Something to, just encourage everybody who's listening. It's like, okay, let's get on to then how can they find out more about you, the book? What's the website that they can go to where they can get this book?
Go to blissbrain.com, and you can get the book at blissbrain.com, and you also get 8 free meditations there, and they're for doing the things in the book. So each one is linked to a chapter. So you read the chapter, and then there are what are called deepening practices at the end of each chapter, including free meditations, free links, videos, and various other resources. So all of my books do this. They have a section at the end saying, here's how you apply what you've learned in this chapter to your life to make it better. So blissbrain.com is a good place to start.
Beautiful. And ladies, I will also have the social media links as well on the show notes where you can, connect with Dawson from there as well. And there's just so much in this book that is it's really truly life-changing. And I so appreciate you coming on and sharing your research, your knowledge, and that you actually wrote this book. And again, I know you've got another one on the way, which just blows me away because you're just, there's so much research in this. I'm like, how does he do that? But thank you. I appreciate you being on.
Nicole, thanks for having me. I love sharing, and I love the thought of all the people who listen and then try it and then feel it and then keep on doing it. So I just love doing this, and I just visualize the world in which all the trauma we've known, people would ever, is just not there. People would ever think of hurting each other or being mean to each other. And I know that world is coming. I have such a sense that we're in the middle of this vast cultural shift. Yeah. So whatever I can do to help nudge the process along, I love doing.
Beautiful, beautiful vision, beautiful thing to hold in our hearts as well. So thank you. Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, I invite you to go out to iTunes and please leave an honest rating and review. In the podcast world, this really helps other women find the podcast and they can see if it resonates with others out there. So I really appreciate all your support and leaving me a rating.